We are very delighted to have Ed Morrissey with us. This is his new book. It's called Going Red, The 2 Million Voters Who Will Elect the Next President and How Conservatives Can Win Them. The book is available, by the way, if you'd like to purchase this for yourself on your way out, and Ed has graciously said he'd be happy to sign these if you would like that. So Vicki from Quail Ridge Books is outside. Hopefully she's going to come on in and listen to the presentation, but she'll be there to help you buy the book, and Ed will be there as well. So you've probably heard of Ed. I mean, who hasn't if you're in the freedom movement, the conservative movement. He's been writing about politics, about policy in his blog Captain's Quarters since 2003. You may know him from hotair.com where he blogs. He also hosts shows there. He's a columnist. If you read The Week, the Fiscal Times, all sorts of places you will have read Ed Morrissey's work. And of course, you probably listened to him on radio as well. So this election season, we know it's one we haven't seen in a very long time. Ed writes in his new book, he's going to talk about this, how he believes that it is conservatives' last best chance to take back the country. He's going to explain how that might happen and who these 2 million voters are that he says will decide this election. Please welcome Ed Morrissey.
Yep. Thank you, Donna. Can everybody hear me all right? All right. Well, I'm Ed Morrissey, first-time author, long-time caller, first-time author. I've been thinking about the 2012 election. First off, before I get into that, I want to just thank the John Locke Foundation. I want to thank Corey, Mitch. I want to thank Quail Ridge Books for being here to sell my book. As Donna mentioned, I'd be happy, delighted, thrilled, ecstatic to sign any copies that you might want to buy at the end of this. Being a first-time author, all this is still pretty new to me, so I'm pretty excited about all of it. And I'm really grateful that all of you are here to hear me talk about this. So the book really starts, both literally, because it actually does start with this in the first chapter, but the premise for the book really started almost 4 years ago. And I'll just take you back to election night, 2012. I was in the studios of Hugh Hewitt. I don't know how many people are Hugh Hewitt listeners. Hugh Hewitt, great guy, good friend of mine. And he brought me in from Minnesota, where I live, to his studios in the undisclosed location in Southern California to sit in on election night because we kind of thought that this was going to be a pretty good night for us. We didn't think it was going to be a huge win, but we were pretty confident about the numbers that we were getting from the Republican Party and from the Romney campaign. We were pretty confident that we were going to win back places like North Carolina, which we actually ended up doing, and Indiana. But beyond North Carolina and Indiana, we thought we were going to win back Florida. We thought we were going to win back Ohio. We thought we had a pretty good shot at winning back Virginia. And none of that came to pass. And the realization actually came in fairly early in the evening when they called Ohio for Barack Obama. And it was such a contentious call that, of course, I think most people remember that Karl Rove on Fox News said, wait a minute, we don't have the data in from the right counties to make sure that that's what happened. And he was technically right about that, but they were also right to make the call because it was fairly obvious that Ohio was not going to be Republican in 2012. And we were sitting around and trying to keep each other from committing harakiri in the studio and trying to figure out what happened. Because clearly we had lost the thread of where the voters were at. We had, for the second straight presidential election, underestimated Barack Obama and his organization. And I think we just didn't really know the voters very well. And I think that became very clear. If we gone into that studio and said, this is going to be a disaster, well, let's go ahead and just rearrange some deck chairs on the Titanic as it's going down, that would have been one thing. But I mean, we were really convinced that things were going to go fairly well that night. Not great, not spectacular, but we thought we were on our way to a solid win. So not too long after that, of course, the Republican Party came to the same conclusion. They didn't know, they obviously did not know what they didn't know, and they tried to figure it out with what they called the Growth Opportunity Project, which the rest of us called the autopsy, because that was really what it was. And at the same time, in the course of writing at hotair.com, I was trying to do the same thing. I was trying to figure out, well, what did we get wrong? Clearly, there were things that we got wrong that were pretty obvious. We didn't trust the polling because we thought the polling was skewed, and turned out it wasn't. I think we all learned a very hard lesson that way. We found out that the Romney campaign wasn't really very well in touch with voters in swing states. We wondered how that happened, because Romney is a pretty successful executive. We thought that he'd put together a pretty first-class campaign, and in many ways he did. But clearly it didn't work. Clearly it didn't succeed. So after stewing on this for a couple of years, I was at CPAC last year, just to give you an idea how fast this book came together. I was at CPAC last year and I was doing a panel about the next election and lessons learned and where conservatives needed to go. And shortly after that, I got a call from Crown Forum and said, we've got this concept for a book that we're percolating around. Would you be interested in writing it? So after a few weeks of writing book proposals and negotiating, I signed on to the project and immediately went on the road for 5 months to do what really Republicans in presidential campaigns did not do, which is to go talk to the communities that matter. Go talk to the voters. Find out what issues drive them. Find out how the Obama campaign managed to out-organize and out-fight Republicans twice in a row. And find out what's changed in communities that Republicans used to be able to compete in. Not necessarily win every single time. And one of the interesting parts about this is that there's a bit of a conundrum here. Because in almost all of these counties, in almost all of these swing states that we're talking about and going red, Republicans win. They win at the local level. They win at the statewide level. Florida, for instance, which is the first chapter in the book, has a Republican legislature and a Republican governor. So does North Carolina. Although in 2012, yeah, Pat McCrory was governor in 2012, right? He was elected that time. Okay, so Ohio, Republican governor, Republican legislature. And yet, we don't compete. We don't compete at the presidential level. So why is that? What are we doing right on one level where we have more state legislative seats and control of more state legislatures than any time since Herbert Hoover, literally, since 1928, and yet we are just, not only do we not win presidential elections, we're getting to the point where we're not even competitive in presidential elections. In the last 24 years, Republican candidate for president, I should say, has won a majority of the vote once, one time, 2004, with George W. Bush. If you remember correctly, some of you might remember this little kerfuffle when George W. Bush actually lost the popular vote by about 500,000 votes, but ended up winning because he won the Electoral College. Al Gore actually won a majority of the popular vote that time. Actually, I'm not even sure Al Gore got to a majority in that time. But 2004 is the only time that we won a majority of the popular vote since, well, really since 1988, when his father did it. So what's going on? What's happening? Well, I got the opportunity to travel, like I said, for about 5 months. My wife, Marcia, over there, who's watching me in the corner there, and wave at everybody, Marcia, so that they know who you are, said goodbye to me for a good part of 5 months while I was on the road traveling to great places like Wake County, North Carolina. And Zan Bunn, who is over there, one of the people that I spoke with here in North Carolina, knows that of the 7 counties that I went to go visit, I have a favorite, but I have to keep that off the record. Mitch is going to edit that little part out of the video. I've got to tell you, I really enjoyed going out and talking to everybody. I did. It was in every single county. People want to talk to you. People want to have that one-on-one connection in politics. And that's what was missing from the Republican presidential campaigns. That does exist when we're talking to people who are running for local and state offices, because they know their constituents. They know their voters. They have to know their voters. They have to do the door knocking. They have to go sit down and have coffee with people, and not just lecture them top down about what it means to be a conservative, but to open up a two-way conversation so that we can find out what are the issues that are driving people. how do we craft a conservative agenda that actually addresses the needs and concerns of voters, not just in normally conservative locations, but in transitional areas, demographically transitional, politically transitional, like Wake County is, like Hillsborough County, Florida is, like Hillsborough County, New Hampshire. There's two Hillsboroughs in the book. I hope you don't get too confused. They're at opposite ends of the book, thankfully. You got Florida first, then New Hampshire last, so two Hillsboroughs. Hamilton County, Ohio. And there's a lot of reasons why they're transitional. Here in Wake County, it's a great reason. A lot of people want to live here. That's one of the reasons why one particular county was sort of my favorite, but we're not going to get into that. A lot of people want to live here. A lot of people come here to study, and they stay because they love Wake County. They like the people. They like the environment. They like low taxes, low regulation. And they bring their politics from other places, and that sometimes ends up being a little transformative for that environment. But it's an opportunity to open up and converse with people about what it is that they are actually looking for. What are the issues that they're seeing in their communities? How does the conservative agenda address those? Not just philosophically, because we do really great at talking philosophically about free markets, limited government, but we don't necessarily know how to draw that final line in presidential elections. Places like the John Locke Foundation are great, by the way, at this, because they have lots of resources. They do lots of good work. But presidential campaigns have not done a good job of that. Another reason why why these are transitional is because there's changing demographics in these states, in these counties. And we have to find a way to reach out from our comfort zones and present a conservative agenda that we know will make people's lives better if it's put into place. We know it. But the only way you're going to be able to explain that is to sit across the table from somebody and say, tell me what it is that's happening in your community that we need to work on. And then I can tell you how the conservative agenda might be able to address that. But we have to be listening, and we have to be open to the feedback that we're going to get on that. And honestly, that's 80% of what the book is about, meeting people. I love these communities. What I really want to do with this book, and the reason why I hope it sells well, other than the fact that I wrote it and I want it to sell well, is that I really want people to know the people in Wake County, North Carolina. I really want people to come to know the people in Hillsborough County, Florida, in Jefferson County, Colorado, to understand that each of these communities is different. Each of these communities have a different context for the political, philosophical, policy issues that are going to come up in an election, and to make sure that presidential campaigns understand that. Now, that doesn't mean you have to have Mitt Romney or whoever else it would be knocking on everybody's door, although a little of that wouldn't actually hurt too much. But it does mean that the campaign has to be structured so that you have both a national top-down sort of message, but also a bottom-up organization that is bringing people in and exciting them about the conservative agenda. And that's what Barack Obama managed to do with the progressive agenda, especially in 2008. In the book, I talk about this because I've talked with people who were out in the field and saw this, about how they used social media not just to ring up likes on a Facebook page or retweets, but to actually find people in different neighborhoods, locate them, introduce themselves to them, get them to be evangelists in their block with people that they knew, by getting to know what was important in those neighborhoods. Now, Barack Obama didn't need to know necessarily what that was, but the campaign did. And what they did was they built an emotional connection by using this peer-to-peer politics that was so strong that it sustained him in a 2012 election that he really should have lost, considering where he was at in terms of job approval rating and quite frankly, where he was at in terms of policy and achievement. That's important. It's powerful. That emotional connection to a vote is powerful. And the only way that you actually really get that in a sustainable way is to connect to people in a very personal manner. I'll give you an example that's not in the book, and this is one I've been kind of using to give you an idea about how this is the way I put it, you contextualize the conservative agenda so that it fits within people's lives. In Cincinnati, the EPA has issued an order, or had issued an order, that the city needed to separate its storm drain system from its sewer system. And this is something that the EPA has actually been working on with other cities. And it was just Cincinnati's turn. Now, Cincinnati is a city that's struggling. The manufacturing base collapsed there. In fact, Hamilton County, Ohio, is the only county in the book that has had a significant population loss as one of its challenges rather than a population growth. Wake County, you guys have had tremendous growth. The first decade of the 21st century, you were the fastest growing county in the United States, which is great. Hamilton County has lost 12% of its population over the last 46 years. The city of Cincinnati has lost 40% of its population over the last 46 years. So the people who were economically able to move out of Cincinnati have done so. The people who are left are struggling. They're having a hard time. It is a city that is in desperate need of some infrastructural work, and this EPA order probably is not coming at a very good time for the city of Cincinnati. So the city of Cincinnati put together a plan to satisfy this EPA requirement, as it was told to me, that is pretty expensive, as you might imagine. I mean, this is heavy infrastructural work. And EPA finally accepted the plan that they came up with. Sometime later, the city of Cincinnati figured out that they could do it cheaper, more efficiently, and save themselves a lot of money. And the estimate that was provided to me was around 40% less. So they went back to the EPA, and they said, no, we've accepted the plan. It's closed. This is the plan that you're in. You have to follow this plan. So as a result, people in Cincinnati in the Metropolitan Water District have to pay hundreds of dollars more every year in fees for the next who knows how many years in order to cover the difference in costs between the two plans. They're going to pay anyway. It's going to be expensive no matter what, but it's going to be a lot more expensive on the plan that the EPA accepted. So when you come into Cincinnati, if you say, government stinks, government's bad, you know, we want to cut government, we want to cut regulation, a lot of people there are struggling. And they want government to work because they need to fix the roads, they need to fix the buildings, they need to find ways to attract some sort of economic base, whether it be manufacturing or something else, back into the city of Cincinnati. But if you go to them and say, you know, can you afford to pay a few $100s extra a year for your water and sewer treatment? No? Well, guess what? You're going to have to do that because the EPA is arbitrarily saying that they're not going to consider any other plan than the one that they originally came up with. That's what we mean by having more subsidiarity in government. That's the reason why we talk about limited government. It's the reason why we talk about having state control and local control over these issues rather than Washington control. That's just one example. There's other examples that are in the book. This one is not in the book because unfortunately I got to it too late to include it in the book. But it's a pretty good example of how you contextualize a conservative message for a particular community in a way that really matters to them. There's another one there's actually two other ones about the EPA in the book. And I guess I was picking on the EPA a little bit, but they are one of the most intrusive agencies in the federal government. And that regulation is extremely powerful for asserting federal authority in areas where it doesn't belong. And the one in Colorado is really easy. That's the Animas River. How many people heard about the spill out of the old abandoned mine on the Animas River? How many people know that it was the EPA engineers that did it? People in Colorado, Jefferson County, Colorado is on the western side of Denver. And it is, that is also a transitional county. But you have on Jefferson County's eastern border, you've got Denver. On the western side of Jefferson County, you've got the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. It's beautiful out there. And people out there are very, very concerned about the environment. Conservatives as well as, as well as progressives. It's just that they have a different approach to it. So you can't go out there and talk about enviro-wackos because some of the people out there that you actually want to attract don't think of it that way. They think of it, we want to preserve a Jefferson County that we've known all along, and we want to make sure it stays that way. So you talk about conservation. And you talk about the fact that the EPA went out and spilled 3 million gallons of polluted water in the Animas River and now wants to treat the whole area as a Superfund site so they can exert even more control over the area. That's how you contextualize a conservative agenda there. I can tell you already, though, that Coloradans are sort of ahead of the curve on that. So if you ever do go to Colorado and make that argument, you're going to find that you have a welcoming ear. So those are the types of things that we didn't do as conservatives, as presidential campaigns. And the challenge is that these swing states are going to become harder and harder to win until we start expanding the footprint of conservatism, of the Republican Party, and that comes from the leadership of the party. And it comes from the leadership of the conservative movement, being out in those communities and making the connections to people in those communities, whether it's the African American community, the Latino community, especially young people. The young people in these counties are thirsty for a philosophy, if you will, an agenda that works. And I can tell you how thirsty they are. They're listening to a 73-year-old communist spout off about how great socialism is, because none of these people were actually lived through the 20th century like most of us have and understood exactly what the end game of socialism is. That's how thirsty they are. We have to be out there answering that. Largely, local candidates, even statewide candidates, have been doing that. But if we want to be competitive in presidential elections, then we have to make sure that we're crafting a campaign that addresses that. And that's what I wanted to get to at Going Red. And I think that if I had to do one takeaway from this, it's that when you do peer-to-peer politics rather than lecturing politics, you just get a much better form of politics, because it's an exchange of ideas, you get feedback, you get to know people, and I think you're never going to get the nastiness out of politics, but I think it's a lot harder to be nasty when you know the people that you're dealing with. Not always. I'm on Twitter. I read the comment sections occasionally at hotair.com, so it's not always the case, but I think largely that's the case. But I do know that you're never going to excite people, you're never going to emotionally engage people in conservatism and in Republican presidential politics until you do that type of peer-to-peer, bottom-up type of campaigning in a serious manner, not just opening an office 2 months before the election and handing out literature, closing it down a month afterwards. You have to be part of the community. The party has to be part of the community. The activists have to be part of the community, not just telling people who they should be, but us embracing people who they are and showing them how the conservative agenda can actually make their lives better. With that said, I am happy to take any questions. That gentleman right back there.
Yeah, I have to do that. Knowing that the Republican Party at the presidential level,
yes,
has an uncanny ability to lose elections.
No, you're right.
And knowing that if Donald Trump doesn't get the nomination, he doesn't have 1,237, it's going to be an interesting convention.
Yeah.
By anybody's guessing. You may want to ask Mitch to turn off the camera at this point, but who in your opinion has the best ability, if you will? Who do you think would be best at doing what you're saying, listening at the grassroots level?
Let me, it's a great question. I get this question a lot. I've been getting this question since even before the book came out, because I was talking about some of the things in the book. The book is really nominee neutral. In fact, the book doesn't focus on nominees at all. There's a couple of mentions of candidates. There's a nice index in the back that I paid to do, by the way, so please read the index a lot. It would make me feel really happy if you read the index a lot. And you'll see Ted Cruz is mentioned, Donald Trump is mentioned, Scott Walker is actually quoted in the book, so he's in the book. But I don't get into the candidates in terms of their ability or inability to, I are an English major, inability to do these things. Technically speaking, theoretically speaking, I should say, anybody can pick up Going Red and say, this is the way I need to run my presidential campaign, this is what I'm going to do. There's also some other good news in the book about this, because the RNC has actually been working on this ever since the autopsy. It's very quiet, although it's not secret. There's been some reporting on it. I've written about it at Hot Air. Selena Zito from the Pittsburgh Tribune-Review has written quite a bit about this. But it's still flying under the radar, really, of the national media. But the Republican Party's put together an organization of about 4,000 people on staff to do this thing out of hard money so it can be used in election campaigning. The idea of it, whether or not they're quite there yet or they're going to get quite there yet, but the idea of that is to provide sort of a turnkey organization to whoever the nominee is going to be. But the nominee is still going to have to know how to use it. So let me just finalize the answer, and I'm going to get over to John here in just a second, because John's going to challenge me on this. But I think that you see characteristics in all three of the remaining Republican presidential campaigns that are applicable to the lessons in Going Red. I think that there are shortcomings in all three of the. Nobody's going to be a perfect match for this as much as I want it to be. And I don't want to go too much farther than that because I think the convention is going to be a very interesting process too. What I would say is if nobody gets to 1237, and there's still a chance that Donald Trump can get to 1237, by the way, before the, it's not for sure that we're going to have a contested convention. It's not the end of the world if we do have a contested convention. But if there is a contested convention, then I think that this is a question that the delegates are going to have to consider. Who's going to be the person who can actually execute a game plan that can win a general election against Hillary Clinton, who's almost certainly going to be the Democratic nominee? John.
Well, this may be a more oblique way of asking the same kind of question, but you used the pronoun we a lot in your presentation, which I assume means conservatives and activists for limited government and or Republicans given the context of the sentence.
Yes.
Well, let's distinguish the two for a moment.
Yeah.
But there is a commonality, which is that whether you're talking about nominating a Republican presidential candidate who can then proceed to compete in the fall, or you're talking about organizations and grassroots activists and people who are trying to advance the cause of liberty on their own or in the private sphere, it seems to me you've got three basic ways to proceed from a perceived position of not winning in order to win.
Right.
And there are three theories that have to do with what is required to get to the finish line. One theory would be the problem is we simply don't turn out and deploy people who already agree with us. So they have people out there who agree with us. They don't vote. They don't call their legislator. There's a kind of a silent majority out there, and we just figured out more technical or rhetorical devices to turn them out and make them active, will win. So that's sort of turnout model thinking. The second thinking would be, for want of a better term, moderation or negotiation. We have some things that are popular, potentially popular with the general public, some things that aren't selling as well. We're going to downplay or change the positions that we have that are not majoritarian positions, at least as we understand it. And we're going to focus on the things that are already testing well. We may even go and borrow some themes from the other side that test well that don't make us regurgitate. So it's kind of a change your
marketing.
Yeah.
It's a marketing thing, yeah.
But it's also maybe substantive in the sense that you may actually sort of moderate on some issues in order to win.
Okay.
The third scenario is persuasion, meaning there are people out there, we know they don't agree with us already, but we're so confident that our ideas are right for them and they don't know that this is actually a marketing challenge. How are we going to convince and persuade people to come around our point? So you can either, we got plenty of people already, but they just don't vote or turn out or make noise. We can never get enough people because some of our ideas are unpopular and we need to go basically triangulate substantively. Or we have a persuasion problem. We have a good idea. We don't necessarily have a good message. We need to message our way to majority.
It's a great question. I would say that Going Red talks more about number 3.
Sort of what I think.
Okay. Number 1, I think, is a fallacy that has been driving Republican presidential campaigns in the last 2 cycles. The idea that we're a center-right nation, naturally a center-right nation, that only just needs to issue the clarion call to the rank and file, and they'll all turn out to vote for the center-right or conservative candidate. I really honestly think that after 2008 and 2012, we should really dispense with that idea because it's not true. We're not a center-left nation either. We are a nation where you have activists on both sides and you have passionate believers on both sides, but in large part, and you find this a lot in Going Red, most people really just want to make sure that things get fixed, that their lives are improved through their vote. And that's the reason why that peer-to-peer persuasion model is so important, because you need to explain to people, well, what is it that needs to be improved? In Ohio, it's education. They're very concerned about education. Well, we can talk about school choice. I mean, there's lots of things on the conservative agenda that would work in those situations. And, but we are mostly just talking about it, again, at the 30,000-foot level, the clarion call level, if you will. That's your first model. The second model is moderation. And what I would say is this. I think the conservative agenda works just fine. I think it would solve most of the problems that we're talking about. And I think the rest of the problems we can rely on the people to figure out for themselves because we treat them like adults with their own choices. And plus you have tensions between libertarians, so-called moderates, conservatives. So obviously you have to build a coalition within the party and within the general electorate to win. So there's going to always be some of that, but the idea here is to find commonalities and to convince is the wrong word, to persuade people that the conservative agenda actually answers these concerns. And that's what Obama did with the progressive model in 2008 and again in 2012. And I went back and talked to people who voted for Barack Obama in 2008. In fact, there was a couple of them here in North Carolina. And they said, we thought that Obama, you know, they were talking to us and they were talking about, well, you know, we're going to be post-partisan, common sense, these solutions were just going to unfold and it was, you know, things were going to improve and that they never delivered on it. Well, I don't think progressivism actually ever delivers. And I think Obamacare is a great example of that. But we weren't offering a competing narrative at that level. So who were they listening to? They were listening to Barack Obama and his very granular, very local-oriented campaign, talking to people about their specific issues and how the Obama agenda related to that and how it could improve their lives. So they were using a persuasion model. As much as people want to say, no, it was a moderation model, they were using a persuasion model. Clinton only used the triangulation model when he had to, right? Second term. Right, when his back was up against the wall, he used the triangulation method. And I mean, let's face it, Clinton is one of the most talented politicians I think we've seen on the national stage. And Bill Clinton now, I'm saying, because Hillary Clinton is a whole other story, but Bill Clinton was one of the most naturally gifted politicians that we've seen probably in our lifetimes. Barack Obama isn't as gifted as Bill Clinton was. Still is a little bit, although he's, you know, obviously he's got some health issues and he's backing Hillary, which is a limiting factor anyway. But so no, I'm arguing the third path, which is persuasion, which is what you have to do if you want to advance an agenda. It doesn't matter what the agenda is. You have to persuade people that that's the agenda that needs to be followed. And you can't do that. You can't persuade people by just saying, come be more like us, because it doesn't work that way. We have to say, let us find out who you are. Tell us what's important to you, because you are really the focus of what it is that we want to do. That is what Obama did, and that is what two presidential campaigns did not do, effectively did not do. This gentleman right over here.
One of the frauds of this whole thing is that before we go out to talk to the folks and say conservatism works, how are you going to get the elected Republicans to believe it works? They're not on the same page, not at all. I mean, time and again, the budget, everything they do, and that's why Trump resonates. You mentioned solutions. He's offering solutions, and they're sick and tired of the establishment.
I'm not sure that Trump is offering solutions as much as he's offering affirmation that things aren't.
He's saying, but the idea is when you look at the deals on the budget, the deals on the TPP, over and over, in the 8 years the Republicans had both chambers of Congress of the past 16, government grew. untested programs, Common Core, No Child Left Behind, that's not conservatism.
No, I agree with you.
But they run around the country saying I'm a conservative.
Well,
And what I'm saying is they have to fix themselves before they worry about fixing us.
let me tell you what I think about has gone on here. Republicans made a lot of promises in the 2014 midterm election that they couldn't possibly keep. In 2010 to some extent too, which was that if you elect majorities in both the House and the Senate, we can repeal Obamacare, we can cut the budget. The problem is that the president is relevant to those things, and unless you have a 2/3 majority in either one of those chambers, you can't just simply dictate outcomes. You end up having to negotiate some sort of agreement, or else nothing passes. And the other part of that, and this is really getting into the weeds and sort of apart from the topic of the book, but Obamacare is an entitlement program. It is not an appropriated program. So you can't defund Obamacare without repealing it. You can defund some of the HHS administrative tasks within Obamacare, but Obamacare collects its own taxes and is required by statute to make the payments, just like Medicare and Medicaid does, and Social Security. So the only way to defund Obamacare is to repeal it. And so Republicans who were making these promises, and I'm getting to your point here, making these promises were setting up an expectation that was never possible to be met. And they would have been much better off just campaigning on saying, look, we need to stop the appointment of liberal justices and packing the court of liberal justices, especially in the DC Court of Appeal, by getting control of the Senate and getting control of the confirmation process, and then using those majorities to try to block as much as we can, block Obama as much as we can until we have another presidential election. That would have been an honest way to go about things. Unfortunately, when you overpromise and underdeliver, which is what's happened, you end up with people saying, the hell with all of you guys, we're going to look for party leaders who are outside the current structure. That's why you get a Donald Trump. It's also, quite frankly, why you get Ted Cruz, who has been sort of a outsider his whole time in the Senate. I'm going to take this and then I'm going to come right back to you.
Can you be a little more specific about what this peer-to-peer campaign looks like?
Sure. Well, let's take a look at the Obama campaign, in 2008 especially, but also they were doing the same thing in 2012. So they were using Facebook, they were using Twitter to gather email lists to gather names, but they were also asking people on these lists and the people that they were contacting, what's important to you? Is it the environment? Okay, and they would make sure that they know that. What is the big issue in your community that needs to be resolved? And they would take the data on that. Then they would go back to these people and say, look, we're really interested in what you have to say about this. Tell us more about this, and let us tell you how we think that this will work, how we think the Obama agenda is going to work for you. And then they would take the people that they found, and they were very careful about making sure they found people in key neighborhoods and key communities that they needed to win. But even more broadly than that, this was a 50-state strategy, but they were trying to focus especially on the areas where they needed to win, where they needed to take states away from the Republican Party, and turn those people into ambassadors in their neighborhoods. And they would there was a lot of things that went into that, but they'd give them a couple $100 to have a pizza party, invite their neighbors in to talk a little bit about, well, Obama's going to fix whatever this issue is in our community because they're talking about doing this with the EPA or whatever it was. So they were listening to people. They were seeking people out. They were listening to people, and they were persuading them, to use John's excellent term. They were using a persuasion model to convert them not just into votes, but into evangelists for the Obama campaign. And it was very, very effective. 4 years down the road, on top of that, let me just back up a little bit because I do hear this, and this is actually true. There was the factor of electing the first African-American president, the factor of trying to get to a post-partisan, Democrat versus Republican sort of thing. People wanted to put that in the rearview mirror. They wanted a figure that they thought would be unifying, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What they did by doing that was they made the vote for Obama about themselves, not about Obama. They were Obama voters. There's this one passage, and it's from It's in the Florida chapter where I was talking to somebody who's in a gentrifying neighborhood in Tampa. And so there's always issues with gentrification. I'm sure it plays out here as well as everywhere else. It plays out in Minnesota too. But this guy went to go visit a neighbor and have dinner over at their house. And the neighbor had a Obama bumper sticker on his refrigerator. Now, I don't know how many people were coming through his kitchen to see the Obama bumper sticker on his refrigerator. So clearly that wasn't meant to say to other people, go vote for Obama. What that meant was, I'm an Obama voter. I'm part of this movement. And it was a reaffirmation every time you looked at the refrigerator that he was part of something special. We don't do that. I'm going to get to you in just a second, Lori. I promise this gentleman here.
It's almost sort of a follow-up on that. It's sort of on the how part of this. I was watching Stossel this weekend, and his show was all on technology.
Great show. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. But one segment of it was on use of technology in doing apparently exactly what you were saying. He focused on cruise because he clearly believed that cruise is doing. I mean, very interesting stuff where you go and you know it sends you to the right people, and then when you ask questions, their answers generate new questions that you get on your. I just, what do you see as the role of technology in doing exactly what you are?
Very large, very large. In Prince William County, Virginia, I went door knocking with a guy named Rich Anderson. He's a great guy. And I mean, I only did it for a few hours on one day. But they have, I think it's called i360. It's an app. There's a couple of these competing apps where when you go door knocking, you ask those questions and you pop the answers in there so that you can be generating this data and collating this data. You also try to find out, you know, who's persuadable, right? So if you're going to go door knocking, you don't go to the "we'll never vote Republican" doors because there's not much point. If they're that dyed in the wool, they're probably not persuadable. But there's a rating, I think it's 0.7 was the limit. So if you're 0.7 Democrat to 0.7 Republican on this little spectrum, you want to knock on those doors and be persuading people. But the way you do that is you ask them, what concerns you? So the technology aspect of this is huge. And the Obama campaign was miles ahead of the GOP and the candidate campaigns. They were miles ahead of this in 2008, and they were still ahead of it. I don't know, how many people remember Orca in 2012 turned out to be a disaster, right? Well, that was also part of the autopsy, and the RNC is fixed that part of it. But that was part of what they were testing out. Technology is huge, but technology is just a tool. The actual peer-to-peer politicking is the guy knocking on the door. Is Rich Anderson going and knocking on doors and talking to people and talking to his constituents, even the ones that might be a little skeptical of him, maybe even especially the ones that might be a little skeptical of him, and have a conversation. What is I see that, you know, you're concerned about this, about the roads here in Prince William County. Well, let me tell you what we need to do about that. We need to get some funds, like block grants, back to the city so that they can take care of their own roads rather than tie the money up at the state level. I mean, that's way theoretical, but I mean, that's the type of thing that you need to do. So technology is very important as a tool. I think what Republicans thought, especially in 2012, that technology was the end in itself, and it wasn't. It was, that technology only works if you're orienting yourself towards that type of ground-up campaign. Otherwise, all you're doing is, and this actually came through in my conversations in Wake County because they're a little skeptical about the RNC effort. Otherwise, it becomes almost an anthropological exercise, and it's borderline offensive to people. Well, all you're doing is collecting data, but you know, just to target me for some sort of advertising. Well, that's not politics. That's you know, that's advertising. Lori had a question.
I was just going to say, in the early days of the Tea Party movement,
yeah,
there was more peer-to-peer type.
Yes.
I think, and then I think that changed a whole lot with all the
yeah.
data. But are there any lessons from the successes or failures of, especially the earlier days, that
well,
be applicable?
I think that there's a difference, though, when you're talking about activists, the activist models, because there's some great activists in the field, right? Again, John Locke Foundation. I mean, it's a think tank, activist think tank. You've got AFP, which is in the same building, which, by the way, keeps popping up because AFP's been doing a lot of groundwork on issues. So you'll see AFP in 3 or 4 of the counties because they're actually trying to do something in parallel, not coordinated. I mean, they're not even, it just happens to be sort of a parallel thing to what the RNC is trying to do with its organizing. But they're very effective at it. And the reason why AFP is effective at it is because they become part of the communities. They open up an office in the communities that they're targeting. They get to meet the neighbors. They talk to people. They look to see what problems can we solve. In this particular neighborhood, what problems can we solve? And while we're solving these problems, we're going to tell people why limited government makes more sense for their lives. And that's the activist model. The activist model is almost always bottom up. So I think the lesson that we learned is that you can't just do top down. You have to have that bottom up. And I think AFP's got a real leg up on that.
But my question then dials right into what you just said, because I'm a very optimistic person.
Me too.
I think your book is going to do great. I think it's going to blow up and it'll become part of the national debate. I think that tons of peer-to-peer information is going to come out from that debate that will give us great support for a conservative candidate. That's where my optimism ends, because all that wonderful, helpful information that I would love is going to be handed over to the national GOP that is very lecture-oriented, and no matter what they hear from us, they're not going to hear it, and they will come forward with another centralist, grow government, solve Republican problems with war programs, like we've had the last 7 or 8 election campaigns. Yeah. Agree or disagree?
Agree in part, and I'd say the jury's out on the rest. Look, I mean, I think the natural tendency of any organization is to focus inward. In talking with Reince Priebus, who I interviewed for the book, and more importantly with some RNC officials that are out in the field, like county GOP chairs and that sort of thing, I think they're actually really trying to be outward oriented. I think the RNC actually did learn a lesson in 2012. Whether or not it's sufficiently internalized remains to be seen. But I think we need to separate too the RNC from the elected GOP officials that we sometimes refer to as the establishment. The RNC is there to provide a structure for Republican candidates to win elections. They don't choose the candidates. I mean, I know that there's a lot of talk about, the RNC is, secretly pulling strings. I think that this, if they are, man, the strings are really either extremely long or very broken in this election cycle. But really what they're there to do is provide a platform to elect Republicans at every level. The RNC is there to do that. What the RNC actually is, and the DNC is the same way, is they're a collection of state parties. That the officials that make up the RNC committee are basically the party leaders in each state. So they have their own organizations. It's somewhat hierarchical, but it's somewhat diffuse as well. When it comes to the candidate, that's the big question. Which candidate is going to end up with control of this mechanism? Is it going to be somebody who understands that this type of thing needs to come from the bottom up, that we need to devolve power away from Washington, D.C.? Or is it somebody who thinks that you can do stuff from on high and dictate outcomes? Well, I think you've got at least 2 candidates in the field that occupy each of those positions. Well, 1 candidate each of those positions. At this point, it's sort of up to the voters, and it will eventually be up to the delegates who come to the convention to make a choice between those 2. Now, I'm not saying that which one of them should be, I'm not endorsing or unendorsing any particular candidate, because it's going to be a tough decision and it's going to be made as a consensus in what is really sort of a parliamentary process at a convention. There's nothing illegitimate about that. That's basically representative democracy. The delegates, we elect the delegates go there, they're bound on the first ballot, some of them are bound on the second and third ballots, and after that, if there's still no if there's still no majority, they're going to have to figure out who the best candidate is, and it's not going to be an easy job. I would kind of like to know that 2,500 of them have my book, but that's that's a different subject, and I'll work on that later. But we just haven't seen that process in 40 years. And we really haven't seen this problem in 78 years, or 68 years. 1948 was the last time a Republican convention, I believe, went to a second ballot. And we nominated Dewey. And you saw how well that worked out. But that's going to be the process. And that is the question. And so you're asking me, am I an optimist or am I a pessimist about that? I'm oriented towards optimism. This book is oriented towards optimism. Other than that, I'll wait and see. And I think...
And I'm going to take the last question
Yep.
for myself. The peer-to-peer communications, of course, you're talking about it in a political context.
Yes.
For an organization like the Locke Foundation, where we're a public policy think tank, we're not an activist organization.
Right, yes.
We're an ideas organization. And so what role do you see organizations like ours playing in this peer-to-peer communications with conservatives? In other words, it's great to communicate to a person, but if you're not understanding the economics of a mandated minimum wage for
Right,
example,
yes.
then where do we go? We don't.
It's critical. It's critical, Donna. In order to go into an connected community, I'll just use the example of the African American community where there hasn't been a lot of communication back and forth, and there's a great deal of mistrust now between conservative circles and African American communities. We really have to know this stuff cold before we go in and start asking people, tell us what your issues are, and we'll try to explain to you how conservative policies will address those better than what you've seen in the past. There's also some other hurdles, by the way, before you even get to that conversation that's discussed in Going Red, but just we'll get, saying that has already taken place and you're there. You need people like the John Locke Foundation to have that information ready. I mean, this is what outfits like the John Locke Foundation, Heritage Foundation, and all sorts of these other think tanks excel at, is arming people up for those conversations. Because if you don't understand the intellectual basis for conservatism and what those actual solutions are and how they actually unfold, and why the progressive alternatives end up becoming destructive and self-defeating, then you're going to go into these conversations. You're just basically going to say, well, you know, liberty, 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 small government, which is exactly what the top-down message was. So if you don't have that information with you when you go into these peer-to-peer conversations, candidates, now I'm talking about campaigns now. I'm not talking about just people, because people can talk to people anytime, and they should be. But if the campaign doesn't have that information, if they haven't been studying this information, this great information that's provided by the John Locke Foundation and others, then they're essentially going into these conversations with nothing to say. And that would be arguably worse than what we've got right now. Because if you show up there and you don't have an answer for any of the concerns that they've got, well, it becomes very easy to dismiss you, and all it does is just make the gulf a little bit wider.
The book is called Going Red, the 2 million voters who will elect the next president and how conservatives can win them. It's written by Ed Morrissey, available outside. Ed,
yes.
thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thank you so much. And big thank you to the John Locke Foundation for hosting this.